The next type of logical reasoning question I'm going to be talking about are assumption questions. And these ones tend to be one of the more difficult ones, and they're pretty tricky because they will, especially considering the answer choices, they will put things in there that are relevant inside the passage but aren't really assumptions of the passage. Assumptions are usually unstated things. They're assumed. So the key here is you're looking for something that's not expressly stated. You have to look, like they might put something in there that is stated in the passage, but that's not it. You're looking for something that's outside of the passage itself, but it's, in a sense, it's almost like an inference. You're taking a look at what the passage says, and you're going to, in some cases, you can try to predict the answer first, but you're going to try to look for something that, if assumed, would make the passage stronger. It's something that completes the passage. And you can look for this in almost like looking for flaws. You're looking for a loophole that you're like, well, if this passage assumes this, then it's okay, and that logic makes sense. Strengthening questions are intended to ask you what exactly of the following statements really helps bolster the argument. Now, these are the type of answer choices that you would look at and you'd be like, oh, the author would really like to, hear this in addition to their argument. It would strengthen it. It would make it more sound. Often you can take a look at some of them through missing information. So in other words, it could be a little bit weak, the argument, but if you added something into there, it would make it stronger and be like, oh, that makes it a lot, that makes this argument a lot more sound. So that's one way to look at it. And another way to look at it is taking a look at its conclusion and some of the adjectives that are surrounding it. Because if you have a certain conclusion and it's making a statement, you want to look and see how it's making that statement, because maybe the strengthening question answer has something that is strengthening the conclusion itself directly. Exactly what the author is trying to say directly in the conclusion is strengthened by the answer choice. So you got to check out those adjectives and verbs concerning it, because the strengthening question can usually be found through one of those two methods. The next type of question we're going to look at is flaw questions. Now, flaw questions are very interesting because they're asking you to look for something that is an error of reasoning in the argument. And it could be something that's missing, or it could be a principle that is actually wrong in it. And the thing about principles is that it may not necessarily be something that is written out in stark terms. It may not be a descriptive character with names such as John and his dog. It might be something that says this question goes from general to specific, and it might be that it's describing the means of how it's being wrong, not necessarily the actual thing that's going wrong. So you have to become familiar with how the LSAT defines different things. Some of these flaws that we can take a look at would be like the general truth applying to a specific instance. In other words, somebody says something in generality, and then they're trying to apply it to a certain individual, or maybe vice versa. Like somebody says that, oh, I only got 2 wrong on these questions that you said to do this on, and everybody else now can't do it because I got 2 wrong. Well, you can't really apply something that's specific to a generality, and sometimes, in some cases, there's a generality, but it can't be applied to a specific case because it's an anomaly. Other types of common LSAT flaws might be switching like the cause with the effect, or maybe suggesting that something causes something even though it only correlates. You know what I mean? Like, for example, we could say there's global warming and CO2 in the air, but just because you have one doesn't mean that one's causing the other. It could be that it's just a correlation, and sometimes they'll put questions like that in the LSAT. You can assume that something has something in common just because maybe it's a locational thing, like 2 people are in a room and someone has herpes, and they're like, oh, okay, well then both of them have herpes. Well, you can't assume that just because one person has something that they both have something. So that's another type of common LSAT flaw to be on the lookout for. And as you take more LSATs and see the flaw questions, you'll start to develop an understanding of what exactly they see as principles. And because if you get it wrong, you'll look and you'll see the correct answer. You say, oh, okay, that's what I mean by this principle applying to the action. Now, principle questions are rather interesting, too, because they're kind of like strengthening questions in that they're bolstering the argument, but it's more like a general idea rather than something specific, like an action or something. A principle is talking about what it says. A principle, which is often maybe like a theory or a guideline of some sort, that when applied to the question, makes the question plausible. It's like the reasoning. The principle is the reasoning of the argument. So you're now setting in truth and in stone the reasoning of the argument with this principle question. So with this, I often suggest, as maybe like with inference questions and others, that you look especially at the conclusion of the argument and see what it's trying to state, and then take a look and see that which principle would most allow for that conclusion to be drawn. You know, you have to look for things that support it and support the evidence too. You have to look to see how the evidence is laid out, and often there's going to be things that have different characteristics as far as being okay and not okay. Sometimes they'll say that something is good for this purpose, but it's not good for this purpose. And you have to find a principle that says you shouldn't do this under these conditions. So you want to look for those little conditions, and then where you practice with those, identifying the conclusion and the evidence, and then matching that principle of thought to the actual principle answer, you'll see that only a certain specific type will truly match it statement for statement. You know, you want to make sure that it really matches it statement for statement that they make. Pointed issue questions are very interesting because they involve often two people or two subjects that are conflicting each other in some way, or maybe not even conflicting, but slightly disagreeing. And you're going to have to take a look especially at least one of the person's conclusions, because sometimes there won't be a conclusion for both, and maybe the second speaker just addresses one point that they're saying and says, oh, well, I agree with you, except I think that this is better. So you want to take a look at what the main conclusion of at least one of them is, because if you can identify that, you'll more likely be able to see what exactly is the point that's at issue, because they're going to have supplementary evidence that may not be what the point is. You know, they could be deviating from the point at issue. That's why you got to look at the original statement, because usually you'll find it either towards the beginning or towards the end. You'll find what exactly they are disagreeing on or choosing to diverge in a slightly different way. So just look for that maybe in the first speaker's first to last sentence, or the second speaker's first to last sentence. Usually you can find it in there. And next there's the paradox questions. Now these paradox questions are talking about resolving an apparent paradox. In other words, two things that seem to not be congruent, things that seem that they shouldn't be going together, but yet somehow they are. Well, what is that special thing that makes for this happening? Why is it that one thing can happen when this says that it shouldn't be, yet it still is? And with the paradox questions, you're going to really have to just look for the answer that best solves it. You want to look for the answer that best says that this can happen, something that can happen, despite it seeming that it can't. And that's where you got to look at the reasoning as to saying why something can or can't. When you look for that sentence where it says that something is going to be able to happen or something is not going to be able to happen, you'll be able to better figure out where the paradox lies, where you're going to be able to resolve that issue. And very often it's going to be pretty easy to point out, because there's not too many things that you could put as a paradox and actually solve it correctly.